practice of medicine identifies defensive responses and blocks them using medications. Relieve the suffering from pain, fever, vomiting, and fatigue. How is this possible? It's possible because of the smoke detector principle, because we have redundant defenses, and because very often defenses are expressed more or in response to smaller cues than is really necessary. The emotions are another good example. This is a diagram to offer an alternative to the usual views psychologists have of emotions. Most often psychologists argue about whether emotions are best interpreted as several distinct basic emotions, or whether they are best interpreted as different extremes on various continua, such as from arousal to calm or positive to negative. However, the emotions are in fact gradually derived from precursor special states to deal with certain kinds of circumstances. In short, they're defenses, that is, at least the ones that are protective against bad situations. On the left side of the diagram are responses that give an advantage in good circumstances. Thank goodness for the good circumstances and the positive emotions we feel when they are present. Emotions are not dimensions of separate modules, they're partially differentiated states shaped by natural selection. So, a conclusion about defenses is quite surprising that most human suffering is perfectly normal, but unnecessary in this specific instance. Except, of course, for that one time in 1,000 when it's absolutely essential. This is how general medicine can be safe, at least most of the time. This concludes our quick review of 6 reasons why the body isn't better. Mismatch, competition with faster evolving organisms, every trait being a trade-off, the constraints of natural selection, and the fact that organisms are not in fact designed for health, but for reproductive success, and that many symptoms of disease are in fact just symptoms. They're protective, they're not the diseases themselves. Of course, an explanation for a specific disease can refer to more than one of these explanations. This is quite a bit different from the usual kind of explanatory paradigm we find in medicine, but it shouldn't cause confusion. What would be lovely is to find one paragraph in each medical textbook about each disease, trying to outline why the body is vulnerable to that disease. Is it because we're living in an environment we weren't designed for? Because of mutations that haven't been selected out? Because of aspects of the trait that are a trade-off? Or what? This should be doable. And when doctors in their fundamental education think about evolution and the origins of disease in the context of every single disease, we'll make progress fast. So one large main conclusion is that evolution is essential to understand maladaptations as well as adaptations. The body is absolutely not a machine. It's a jury-rigged device with all kinds of connections that are explained only by the force of natural selection. And natural selection does not just explain why they're perfect. Natural selection also explains why the body is far from perfect. The implications of evolutionary thinking for medicine could go on and on. Here's a short list. Some people imagine that there's a normal genome. There's no such thing. There are just genes that make organisms that reproduce more or less successfully. What about explanations for individual differences? We do need those, but we also need explanations for universals. Why we all have an appendix, why we give birth through a canal that's so narrow, and why cancer is so frequent. The design of the body is exquisite in some regards, but it's very poor in other regards. In fact, even the word design probably is inappropriate. But you should expect poor design in many aspects of the body, and for very good reasons, not only because natural selection is weak. But as soon as you think something is a poor design, it's wise to pause and consider your hypothesis more clearly, wondering if perhaps natural selection might have been more subtle than we realize. And finally, studying these questions is extraordinarily interesting. They're hard to answer, and the methods used to answer them, the comparative method and trying to assess the characteristics of design relative to expectations, are not those usually familiar to medical scientists. This leads to plenty of misunderstanding, but all that is for another lecture. It's essential to recognize, however, that it's still just getting started. At best, we are in Schubert's unfinished basement, with many people around the world gradually establishing connections, collaborations growing, and research projects on evolutionary topics becoming more and more frequent and more sophisticated. In an effort to bring together scholars and researchers and clinicians who share these interests, the website www.evolutionandmedicine.org has been established. At that site, you can and sign on to get an occasional newsletter, and eventually we hope to have active discussions on that site. I hope you've enjoyed this introduction to the series on evolution in medicine, and that you'll enjoy the other lectures in the series.